Hello everyone, this is Robin Warder, host of the true crime podcast, The Trail Went Cold. If you grew up watching the classic television show Unsolved Mysteries, then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I profile a new unsolved murder or missing persons case and share all the baffling details. Afterward, I provide my own personal analysis and theories about what might have happened. This is a show for true crime buffs who are fascinated by cold cases and love to discuss them and pick them apart in an attempt to figure out the truth. So be sure to check out our podcast to learn about some truly bizarre unsolved mysteries where the trail went cold.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Citizen Detective. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This episode takes us to the University of Virginia, where a star athlete's bad behavior goes ignored for too long. Yeardley Love was born on July 17, 1987, and she grew up in Cockeysville, Maryland, which is a suburb of Baltimore. She attended Notre Dame Academy and played varsity lacrosse and field hockey. She was actually named an all-county lacrosse player in 2006. She lived with her mom, Sharon, and her older sister, Lexi. Unfortunately, in 2003, while she was in high school, her father had passed away of prostate cancer. Yeardley has always wanted to go to the University of Virginia for college. Now, this school is very difficult to get into for out-of-state applicants, with an acceptance rate of only about 12 to 17%.
Oh, wow, that's competitive.
Yeah, so her father had gone there, and she wanted to honor her father by going there, and her uncle had also gone there and played lacrosse. Now, Yeardley was ecstatic when she did get into the school, and she got in as a lacrosse recruit. So she was committed to play lacrosse for UVA. And lacrosse was a huge part of her life. She played defense for the Cavaliers, which is the UVA team, and she had the jersey number 1.
Wow, number 1.
Yeah. Other than lacrosse, she was also a member of the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority.
Okay, she's busy.
Yeardley was described as having many friends. She was fun to be around and just a great team player. And at the time of the event we're discussing, she was a senior, majoring in political science and minoring in Spanish. She lived in an off-campus apartment with a roommate, Katie, that was a friend of hers from home, and they were also teammates on the UVA lacrosse squad. Yeardley had a job lined up in New York City for after graduation. So this is an exciting time for Yeardley. It was senior weekend, and graduation was just 3 weeks away. And lacrosse was entering the NCAA championship season. So there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Busy.
Yeah, all the kids were, they were playing hard and they were partying hard, and Yeardley was no exception. A few weeks prior, Yeardley had broken up with her long-term boyfriend, George Hughley. Now, George was also on the lacrosse team at UVA. He was considered to be a good-looking guy who was a practical joker and kind of just a guy's guy. He actually lived one building away from Yeardley. Their senior year.
That's pretty close.
Yeah, no, the two had actually known each other for a couple of years. They were friends, and they started dating a few years prior in 2007. And a lot of people say they were the perfect couple. They were both gorgeous, wealthy, successful, smart, athletic. They seemed to have everything going for them. On the outside, that is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the spring of 2010, Yeardley had called off the relationship because George was becoming increasingly belligerent. He drank excessively, and he was really just a negative presence in her life, and she didn't want that anymore. Their relationship was characterized as on and off, but more recently, as her friends say, it was mostly off.
She's also moving to New York, changes in her life, a different time.
Yeardley also reportedly had started seeing someone else, another lacrosse player named Mike Burns. On May 2nd, it was a Sunday afternoon, Yeardley spent the day taking a break from lacrosse and hanging out with her roommate, Katie. They went to some bars, went out to eat with some friends. This was what they would call Sunday Fun Day.
Oh, of course.
Yes. They got back to their apartment at about 10 p.m. that evening. Katie had gone back out, but Yeardley decided to stay home. She took a shower and she went to bed. Katie came home at about 2:15 a.m. with a friend of hers, and she went in to check on Yeardley. Now, when she saw Yeardley, she noticed that Yeardley was face down on her bed. Her hair seemed messed up. And so at first glance, she thought she was maybe just passed out. And at closer look, she saw that there was blood all over the pillow.
Oh.
And she would soon notice that the door to Yeardley's room had a hole in it.
Oh, okay.
So Katie, of course, calls 911, and Katie and her friend were told to move Yeardley to the floor and to begin CPR. Minutes later, at 2:26 a.m., first responders arrived. Now, everyone assumed that this would be an alcohol-related situation because that's really what Katie had guessed, because why would you think anything else? As a college student, you don't have a care in the world. Why would you ever think
I guess so,
something?
but there's a hole in the door and there's blood. So actually, my mind would have gone to something more sinister, I think.
Your mind's different than most people's.
That's true.
Patrolman K.W. Chapman later testified that when he arrived at the apartment, he found a hole in the bedroom door and Yeardley was lying on the floor next to her bed wearing only underwear. He says he could not detect any respiratory activity. The right side of her face was bruised and her right eye was swollen shut. Her chin was also scraped and bruised. He testifies that he could tell that she was, quote, the victim of some act of violence. Police reports say that although rescue squad members performed life-saving measures for about 25 minutes, the victim was considered dead on arrival. Detective Lisa T. Reeves was summoned to the scene because this was suspected to be a homicide, and she was a homicide detective. Now, murders in this town were very, very rare, and no student had ever been killed by another student on that campus since it was founded.
Okay.
The detective learned from Katie that Yeardley had recently ended a relationship with George Hughley. Now, this was a good place to start.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah, so she went to George's apartment at 7 a.m. Monday morning, and she found him there, and he was very cooperative. He agreed to go downtown to the police station with her. When George got to the police station, he waived his rights. He did not request a lawyer, and he did not want to call his parents. He did quickly admit to the detective that he went to Yeardley's apartment that night because he was, quote, so pissed that she would not talk to him.
Well, that doesn't sound good.
He also admitted to kicking in the door, and his legs had cuts that supported this admission. Now, at first, George was a little bit vague, and he did not admit to hitting Yeardley at all in the face. However, as the interrogation progressed, he started to give up more and more. He did admit to grabbing Yeardley's throat and to shaking her a little and hitting her head against the wall.
Ooh, he's walking himself right into a confession. He's confessing.
Yep, he is.
Okay.
He also said that Yeardley, quote, freaked out when he entered the room and became aggressive. I mean, he banged down the door and she was sleeping. Of course she would be freaked out.
I would call it defensive, not aggressive, but I got it.
He says he grabbed Yeardley and, quote, shook her a little before a struggle ensued on the bedroom floor. So what we have here is George Hughley admitting that on May 3rd, 2010, he was involved in an altercation with Yeardley Love, and that during the course of the altercation, he shook Love and her head repeatedly hit the wall. Another affidavit written by Reeves stated that Hughley said that at one point during the altercation, he saw blood coming from her nose. They had both fallen on the floor, and after the altercation, he pushed Yeardley onto the bed and left. He says when he left, she was alive, but she was, quote, flopping like a fish.
Oh.
He admits that as he left, he took her laptop as what he calls collateral, and he chucked it in a dumpster. Now, he admitted that the two had had an email correspondence in the day leading up to the incident, but he provided the location of the computer, and it was quickly recovered by the police. They actually dug out the laptop from a dumpster, and forensic analysis revealed that the emails from George to Yeardley had contained several threats.
So he didn't take it as collateral. He took it because it was incriminating.
He called it collateral.
Okay.
But
well,
yes.
It doesn't sound like that to me, but
Correct.
okay.
Now, the main question here, Megan, is at this point, whether George knew that he had killed Yeardley. Quite some time into his interview on Monday, May 3rd, the detective says, quote, "I have to tell you something. She's dead. You killed her." To which he responds, "She's dead? How is she dead? Please, please tell me she is not dead." And you can listen to this interrogation online. And he clearly seems shocked. Either he's a great actor or he is shocked. And the detective says, "George, I wish I could do that, but, she's a 22-year-old and the life has gone out of her." To which George responds, I did not hurt her. I never did anything that could do that to her. We were just going to talk." He said that he had went over there to try to reconcile because the two had had a fight the last time he saw her and they had recently broken up. Then George says, "Kill me," as he's in tears. He leans his head against the wall as he is handcuffed. He was clearly distraught over the news.
Okay.
George is arrested and charged with Yeardley's murder.
Okay.
Meanwhile, police are obtaining a search warrant for George's apartment, and from it they had seized shorts that he was wearing during the assault. And interestingly, in his shorts, he had his passport along with the keys to his Bronco. So some say that the passport in his pocket may imply that he was thinking about running after this. So
Seems like it.
Does this imply premeditation? I don't know. It's possible.
No, not necessarily. It just implies after he realized what he did, he wanted to get, he was going to flee.
I believe the implication is that he had the passport in his pocket when he went over.
Oh,
but
I see.
I'm not positive if that's the case.
Okay.
They also found a T-shirt with red stains on it. They found a letter he had written to Yeardley. They also collected hair and DNA samples from George. An autopsy was performed, and Yeardley's body was released to her family for a funeral on the following Saturday. The Charlottesville medical examiner ruled that Yeardley's death was a homicide by blunt force trauma. It was stated that her injuries were so extreme that her right eye was bashed in and her brain was severely bruised.
Ugh. That's from hitting her head on the wall.
Now, before we go further, let's take a minute to discuss who George Yeardley is.
Okay.
Now, he's, in fact, George Yeardley V, and he was born on September 17th, 1987, to parents Marta and George IV. He had a sister named Taryn. George grew up in a very wealthy suburb of D.C. called Chevy Chase, Maryland. Now, the Yeardley family money came from lumber, and it expanded into development in the D.C. area. Almost all of the previous Georges, I'm talking about George 1 through 4, had attended exclusive prep schools and elite universities. Marta, in her own right, was also successful. She had her own business degree from Georgetown, and she was also a model for Saks Fifth Avenue.
Wow.
Now, George's parents split when he was just 9 years old, and it was a very contentious split. There were fights over custody, fights over where they're going to live, court battles over money. It was so bad that the couple was actually ordered not to argue in front of the children.
Ugh.
As mentioned, the family was very well off, and as such, George attended the elite Landon School, which is outside of Washington. Now, the students who go to the school epitomize money, wealth, power, and privilege. The tuition for the 2021-22 school year was nearly $50,000.
Oh.
It's actually also considered a lacrosse powerhouse and a feeder school to the country's most exclusive universities. Fun fact, the 5 members of the famed Duke lacrosse team who were accused of rape and later exonerated, they all attended Landon.
Oh, okay. I don't know much about the lacrosse schools, so that's interesting.
Now, at the school, George was the quarterback of the football team, and he also excelled at lacrosse. As I mentioned, he ended up being a lacrosse recruit to UVA. Now, as the quarterback of the football team, he's wealthy. He was playful. He liked to have fun. He didn't care much about school, but always did well. He was one of those kids who did just enough to get by.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no reports of delinquent or other bad behavior while he was at Landon, although he did drink a lot and he did party a lot.
Okay.
Although keep in mind this is anecdotal because the school refused to discuss his case with the media, as we would expect for a school like this.
Right.
Although George was described as a bit cocky, there was no reports of aggressive behavior with females. Now, when he got to UVA, he wasn't the star athlete that he was in high school. He was a second-string midfielder. He really didn't stand out on the lacrosse field. This was probably a bit different for him. He was kind of the big man on campus at Landon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, George had majored in anthropology, and as mentioned, he began dating Yeardley soon after their first year. Surprisingly, he was not in a fraternity, but he did seem to embody the frat boy culture. He drank a lot, he always partied, and besides drinking with his buddies, he often drank with his father. So his dad, George IV, really liked to party. And he partied often with the lacrosse kids, which was his son George and George's friends. He would also take the kids to his vacation home in the Outer Banks and out on his 40-foot yacht. It seems like drinking excessively was a family affair for the Hugleys.
That's a shame.
By his senior year at UVA, George was drinking daily. And he had a very cocky attitude, like, I'm George Hughley. You can't mess with me. And although Yeardley tried to break up with him at times, friends would say that he had this attitude that, she can't leave me. I'm George Hughley. I'm a hotshot lacrosse player, although he was not, in fact, a hotshot lacrosse player.
Wow.
A closer look into his history would reveal some disturbing behavior that some might say were an indication of the tragedy that was to occur. Turns out George did have a problem with violence. It just went under the radar and no one seemed too concerned.
Okay, what happened?
So let's start with November 2008. Now, George was pulled over and arrested in Lexington, Virginia by female officer Rebecca Moss. Now, she saw him drunkenly weaving through traffic, and she told him to get a ride home or she would arrest him. Mm-hmm. Now, he was underage too, mind you. So the fact that she's even giving him the option to get a ride home, he should have taken that. But rather than saying, thank you, officer, he yelled at her and said, quote, I'll kill all you bitches. He became combative. And so she and another officer had to tase him, and he ended up being arrested.
Oh my God.
Now, at a hearing on the incident later, George said he had absolutely no recall of the event whatsoever.
So he blacks out also when he drinks. Unless he's lying, it sounds like he blacked out.
Yeah, I agree. He was convicted of public drunkenness. He was ordered to pay a $100 fine, which is pennies for him.
Yeah.
And he was given a 60-day suspended sentence, and reportedly he served 50 hours of community service. Now, he did get some punishment for this, but the biggest issue here is that this incident was not reported to the university as their code of conduct required. As a result, his lacrosse coach had no idea either. He would have been kicked off or should have been kicked off the team had this been reported.
Right.
Now, another incident occurred soon after. In 2018, a fellow student reported that an angry George put his hands around her throat at a bar. She said he became upset because she had told one of his coaches about his excessive drinking. Then, in February of 2009, George punched a sleeping teammate who had walked Yeardley home from a bar. He gave this guy a black eye. So apparently George had heard a rumor that this guy tried to kiss Yeardley, so he just went up to him and punched him when he was sleeping.
No, he's quite a history of violence then.
Yeah, that same month, he grabbed Yeardley and pinned her to a table at a bar. He had to be dragged off her by some fellow lacrosse players.
Oh my goodness.
And then in February of 2010, a lacrosse player from another school was attending a party at George's apartment and walked in to find Yeardley in a chokehold by George. So once this guy walked in the room, he released Yeardley. Yeardley ran out in tears. She was hysterical and she was visibly shaken and upset.
Oh, wow.
It's reported that soon after this incident, she began seeing this gentleman that, I guess you could say, intervened. Now, after this incident, George wrote Yeardley a letter apologizing for the way he treated her. This letter was admitted to evidence at trial and states, quote, Yeardley, I cannot describe how sorry I am for what happened this past weekend. I am horrified with the way I behaved and treated you. I am scared to know that I can get that drunk to the point where I cannot control the way I behave or act. I am horrified to think that I was using physical force to keep you in my room. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry again and hope to talk with you when you feel that you can. I can assure you, though, that I will never act as I did on Saturday night. I'm sorry again. Love, George. Needless to say, this letter shows that he kind of knew he had a problem.
Obviously.
Yeah. A few months later, they had another blowout. On April 27, 2010, Yeardley found out that George was seeing a sorority sister of hers, and she and George had it out in his apartment in front of two other girls. During this altercation, she hit him with her purse. After that event, the two started an email correspondence that really highlighted the deterioration of their relationship. George begged her, help me make this work. Yeardley said, I don't know what to do. I've never been in a relationship like this. There's a lot of back and forth. Things got really ugly, though, on April 30th, 2010, when George emailed Yeardley stating, quote, this is so effed up on so many levels. I should have killed you. I'm still in utter disbelief at everything that has happened recently and how you handle this.
Should have killed you?
Yeah, so this is a threat, and Yeardley showed this email to several friends and told her mother about it. And her mother had suggested that she apply for a restraining order. But
she?
unfortunately, Yeardley declined. Presumably, she thought she could handle George on her own and that perhaps legal action was an overreaction.
Ugh.
Unfortunately, this would prove to be untrue and not at all an overreaction, as just days later, Yeardley would be murdered.
It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the restraining order would have prevented that.
Of course not.
It might have, but it doesn't mean that it definitely would have.
Now let's take a closer look at the day that Yeardley was murdered. On Sunday, May 2nd, George played golf with his father and some of his friends at a nearby resort. This was part of the lacrosse team's annual golf tournament. Now this day, George began drinking beer by 9:30 a.m. and was reportedly intoxicated at the reception afterwards. Now his parents were both in town separately. Remember, they were divorced. So again, it was senior weekend and the team was entering into the NCAA championship. So George had drank all day on the golf course, and then he went to dinner with his father and two teammates where he continued to drink.
You think his father would, at least intervene at some point, realizing how intoxicated his son was, how he was behaving? Yeah. It's really a shame that he wasn't more of a father figure and, kind of viewed himself as like a friend to party with his son.
You also have to wonder, who's the adult here? Like, who's driving all these kids around from
oh my gosh,
from the golf course to the reception to the restaurant? I'm not sure that Uber was really a thing then. Maybe they had taxis, but I don't know.
Yeah.
So this dinner was cut short because of George's drunken behavior. According to one of his teammates who was at the dinner, it just got to the point where they wanted to get out of there because it was an embarrassment. George had urinated outside of the restaurant, and he was just extremely inebriated. They returned to their apartment at 10:30 p.m. that evening, and George continued to drink beers. So now we're talking about drinking for 13 hours, right?
That's a lot.
His roommate said that George was very drunk, and by 11:15 p.m. he was extremely intoxicated. At this point, there were two other guys at the apartment with George, and these two left the apartment at about 11:40 p.m., and they were gone for about 15 to 20 minutes. When they returned, George was no longer there. It would be revealed that while the men were out, George had sent a number of texts to various women asking them to hang out, and they all declined. So now you have a guy who has anger issues, who's inebriated, and rejected. Not good.
This is not a good combo.
Not good. So George decided he would leave the apartment and go walk over to Yeardley's building. He climbed the outdoor stairwell to her second floor landing, and he entered the front door, which was unlocked.
So he broke in.
He's still not allowed to be there,
yeah,
but it wasn't breaking and entering, but it was entering
without permission.
Sure. Once he entered the apartment, he then noticed that Yeardley's bedroom door was locked. Now, George returned to his apartment at about 12:15 a.m., and one of his roommates says that there was a change in his demeanor, somewhat of a blank stare on his face. Now, they asked him, what was going on, where had he been, and George said he had been drinking with a different teammate. And one of the roommates kept saying, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? And he just didn't get a response. They knew something was kind of up with George at this point.
Okay.
The timeline becomes very clear now, because there was a student living below Yeardley who heard a very, very loud sound from above at about 11:50 p.m. This is directly in the same timeline with the roommates and when they left and when George had left. This student explained that it sounded like someone was slamming the trunk of a car. That's how loud it was, as if you'd really slammed something really hard. She says then the noises stopped. She heard footsteps descending the stairs and then observed a man, later identified as George, walking away outside. Unfortunately, inside the apartment, Yeardley was dying from a head injury. So if you recall, the roommate didn't get home till after 2, and this was at midnight. So that's, a good 2 hours that she was by herself.
Poor girl.
Hi, I'm Anna Thomas, and let me tell you about my podcast, Apple for the Teacher. It sure sounds like it's about reading, writing and arithmetic, but don't let the title fool you. I'm a teacher from Australia and tell true crime stories associated with schools, which go far beyond shootings and teacher sexual misconduct. If you're like me, you may feel that you know enough about some high-profile cases, such as Ted Bundy and the Zodiac Killer. Apple for the Teacher presents lesser-known stories, such as albino student murder in Africa, schoolgirl sexual slavery in Libya, a school suicide bombing in Pakistan, a student murdered and buried in his school in India, a teacher beheaded in France, Polish teachers executed by the Nazis, just to name a few. But you'll also find school-based tragedies such as a school bus stranded in a snowstorm, a school wiped out by a landslide, the drowning of students in a sinking ship. It can be described as a mixed bag of diverse stories. So if you're looking for something a little different in the true crime genre, then give it a listen. And I hope you can join me soon. But until then, remember to be a good apple.
So after George's arrest, one of his lawyers says, "We are confident that Miss Love's death was not intended but an accident with a tragic outcome." So the main question here is, did George intend to kill Yeardley? It's very clear that he was the one who was in that apartment with her, but did he intend to kill her and or know that she was dying when he left her? Now, George was initially charged with murder, but as we often see, additional charges were soon piled on. So felony murder, robbery, burglary, statutory burglary, and grand larceny for stealing of the computer.
Okay.
On April 11th, 2011, a hearing was held to decide whether to send the case to a grand jury for indictment. Now, George waived his right to appear, and the prosecutors presented evidence to the judge, which included witness testimony from Katie, who found Yeardley, George's two roommates who testified that he was angry and drunk and he left the home at that same time that Yeardley was murdered. And at this hearing, we get a glimpse of the planned defense. Now, of course, he retained private defense because he had money. So his defense attorney says, quote, "He had no intention, no motive, and he did not know that Miss Love was dead or had any significant injury." At this time, it was very obvious that they were going to try to get the jury to go for a lesser murder charge than murder one.
Yeah, that seems obvious to me too.
I don't think anyone was surprised that the grand jury did in fact issue an indictment, so now it was full steam ahead towards trial. The trial began on February 6, 2012, and the jury was comprised of 7 men and 7 women. It lasted 2 weeks and included nearly 60 witnesses. The jury was allowed to watch the video of George's interview. They also saw all the emails between him and Yeardley. The defense really tried to argue that the texts that George sent to other women on the night of the murder show that George wasn't planning on killing Yeardley.
Oh, because he's trying to initiate contact with other women, so he's not sitting there planning a murder. I think they're grasping at straws a bit. At some point, they also tried to say that her cause of death was from a mix of alcohol and Adderall. Oh, come on.
But that was during cross.
Don't know that I see premeditation here, to be honest, but I don't first of all, I think those two arguments are kind of silly.
Yes. So the jurors heard testimony regarding George's injuries, the history of his violent behavior, Yeardley's cause of death. They also saw crime scene photos, as we would expect them to. On February 22nd, 2012, the jury began deliberating, and after just 9 hours, they found George guilty of second-degree murder. They rejected the first-degree murder charge. He was also found guilty of grand larceny for taking the computer, but not guilty of those other charges that I mentioned. What I find interesting is the jury was swayed by the video of George's interview, because the video was initially shown to show that George admitted to his actions that night. But this kind of backfired, because the jurors observed from George's demeanor that he did not know that Yeardley was dead, and once he learned it, he was quite distraught. So his change in demeanor...
The shock? The emotion. Instead, the jury saw someone who didn't know what he had done and probably didn't plan it.
So the jurors believe that George did not plan this, so they had to go with second-degree murder because that was more fitting. Interesting the way it backfired, showing the video.
It does seem more fitting to me, given what you've told me, even though, I don't know everything. But it does seem more appropriate right now.
The jury recommended a 26-year sentence that would be 25 years for second-degree murder and 1 year for the grand larceny. At the sentencing hearing on August 3rd, 2012, George's lawyers acknowledged that he did in fact have a drinking problem, to the point where his friends were considering staging an intervention. But what I don't like here is his lawyer said if his friends had intervened, then none of this would have happened. So they're almost trying to deflect blame and put it on other people, which I think is bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things, like you could say maybe if his father didn't drink with him, maybe, a lot of things could have happened, but, the blame is really on one person.
But as the prosecutor points out, which I fully agree with, quote, the issue isn't too much alcohol, it's too much violence. And he pointed out George's past transgressions and all the times that he had a chance to clean up his act, but he chose not to.
Yep.
Now, what I find really disgusting is George addressed Yeardley's family in court saying, quote, I'm so sorry for your loss. I hope and pray that you may find peace. I see no remorse here, and deflecting blame your loss instead of my responsibility for your loss.
We've heard this over and over again. That is not a sincere apology, and it's not a recognition of response or an acceptance of responsibility.
I totally agree. The judge sentenced George to 23 years for second-degree murder conviction and 1 year for the grand larceny conviction, but these to be run concurrently. And this was a little bit of a lesser term than recommended by the jury. Not much, but
yeah.
In Virginia, a judge can lower but not increase a jury's recommendation.
Okay.
Now, George had a lot of support in the courtroom. He had parents, grandparents, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. A lot of people were supporting him. After the sentence, Yeardley's mother and Yeardley's sister did not comment on the sentence, but they did say that they were relieved to put this behind them, but that they find no joy in other people's sorrow. In a statement, George's family said that they love George and will always support him, and that they continue to believe that Yeardley's death was an accident.
I mean, it sounds just a little bit like denial, but okay.
Under Virginia rules, George is required to serve at least 85% of his sentence, and he is scheduled for release on May 30th, 2030 at the age of 42, which is still quite young.
That concerns me.
Yeah.
He's still young. Even though it's an appropriate sentence, he's still young.
As expected, George appealed the convictions, but later dropped the appeal of the grand larceny conviction.
Yeah.
In June 2013, the Virginia Court of Appeals agreed to hear George's case, which
Really?
I'm shocked about. So he had 8 points on which he felt he should be awarded a new trial.
Okay.
George's new lawyer argued that he had ineffective assistance of counsel.
Always.
Oh, like everyone will always say that. And of course, this is brought up to say that it denied him his constitutional rights. Now, the reason I was curious as to why, like, what about the defense? Because remember, he retained private defense. So what about his defense was ineffective? And they say that at trial, one of his lawyers had gotten the stomach flu and missed 2 days of the trial. And those were crucial days because it was the cross of the medical experts.
That doesn't work for me.
Me neither. George's attorneys also said that a certain prospective juror should have been struck after she voiced doubts about her impartiality.
I mean, that's a possibility.
Yeah.
If you can't be impartial, okay.
Other points focused on jury instructions and about the definition of the word malice, which is a prerequisite to second-degree murder.
Oh.
They also talked about a change of venue. Either way, in March 2014, the Court of Appeals upheld his conviction and refused to reconsider when petitioned to do so. The Virginia Supreme Court refused to hear George's appeal, as did the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015.
Oh.
Most recently, in August of 2021, the Virginia Supreme Court refused to hear George's appeal, as did the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015. So he's pretty much exercised his appeals. He did also petition for a writ of habeas corpus that was denied as well.
Oh, I see. Okay, that makes sense.
As for the University of West Virginia, did they take any responsibility, and should they have? I mean, it really depends on whether they were on notice that Yeardley was in danger from George.
Would it also depend on whether or not they were fostering, like, you know, a heavy drinking community, or, you know what I mean? Not just specific to Yeardley and the danger, but the dangers of excessive drinking and not really doing much to rein that in, I wonder.
Yes, and also it was a little bit of a wake-up call for the student body, because it was about, you can't just watch this abuse and not report it.
Yeah,
because
I
a
agree.
lot of people did see the abuse, and although they helped Yeardley, it wasn't actually reported.
Yeah.
So there's really no question that his bad acts were noticed and not reported. We're not sure if this is because of like a lacrosse team honor code, or because of, you know, people just not wanting to get involved and just look the other way.
And
But
sometimes people just assume, well, someone else will do it. You know, someone else will report it.
UVA now requires students to report arrests, but are they actually doing background checks on each student to ensure that they are fully disclosing such incidences? Probably not. So it's just self-report. Like, students are asked if they have any arrests.
Oh, that's not really effective. I mean, some people will be honest just at the fear of being investigated, but I wouldn't say that's the most thorough way to do it.
Yeah. We did see some movement in the right direction, though, because after Yeardley's death, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law that makes it easier for people who are in a relationship, but not married or cohabitating, to obtain a protection order against their abusive partner.
Oh, good.
So other than legislative change, there has been some other good that has come out of this tragedy. Yeardley's mother founded the One Love Foundation, of course named after Yeardley, and her jersey number.
Oh.
Now, what they do is they educate young people about healthy and unhealthy relationships, empowering them to identify and avoid abuse and learn how to love better. The nonprofit also offers resources to help determine when someone is in an abusive relationship, and there's something called My Plan. It's an app that they developed with Johns Hopkins University. The foundation also raised $1 million for new sports facilities and a scholarship at Yeardley's high school, Notre Dame Prep. As for George's family, they continue to stand by him.
Well, I mean, that's not surprising. They stood by him then, and they're his family. I mean,
They still say that Marta, George's mother, still chalks Yeardley's death up to a drunken accident, saying that there was no choking or anything like that, but Yeardley must have hit her head when they fell off the bed.
okay, that's not accepting.
I think I don't know if that's denial or what.
It's certainly not accepting responsibility, and either she's, that might be just a public denial, or maybe that's what she really believes. I mean, if he sat through the trial, the nature of the injuries, what you told me, seems like very indicative that he did some real damage to this girl.
I mean, she does acknowledge the pain that the Love family is experiencing, and she does say she is sad and sorry that Yeardley is gone. Marta disclosed that she visits George often and that he is working on finishing his college degree through a University of Ohio correctional program. And he's scheduled, as I mentioned, to be released in 2030. I am happy to hear that he is in college.
Using his time productively. You always say that, Amy. You like to see what people do with their time.
Recently, in 2012, Sharon Love won a massive judgment in the civil wrongful death suit that she filed against George. The jury awarded her and Lexi each $7.5 million in compensatory damages. Some interesting facts emerged at the civil trial. Testimony showed that in the 30 hours leading up to the murder, George had consumed 44.5 drinks.
Oh my
gosh. His
gosh.
own lawyer noted that his client's brain was, quote, working at the level of an amphibian.
Well, I think that probably should show you that, at least support the fact that premeditation really probably was not possible.
Yeah, he was not capable of planning, and obviously planning is the requisite intent for first-degree murder.
Mm-hmm.
So although the family was awarded a high amount, it is unclear how George will pay the judgment because he is currently earning only 55 cents per hour working in the print shop at the prison that will be his home for the next 7.5 years. However, his family does have a lot of money, so I would imagine that the Love family will see some of that.
I don't know. It's not a judgment against his family.
Yeah.
It's a judgment against him.
He probably has money in the bank or trust funds.
I mean, it's possible, but if he has no means, then what'll happen is, he'll be ordered to pay, a certain percentage of paychecks in the future until such time that he can actually finish the entire, or, pay off the entire amount, which is probably going to be a very long time.
Yeah. So to conclude, this case is about the warning signs of partner abuse, toxic masculinity, and mainstream society's enabling of alcoholism and the rampant alcohol culture that we see on college campuses. Now, the reality is that a restraining order might not have saved Yeardley from George's rage, but UVA did have the power to save her. What should have been done, perhaps throwing George out of the university after just a couple of these incidences, was not done, and Yeardley paid the ultimate price here.
Yeah, I think that's very clear.
Although this is such a tragic case, there has been some good that came out of this, and I urge everyone to check out One Love Foundation, download the My Plan app, and if you see something, say something.
Yeah, I would have to agree. Spread the word about this case. There's lots we can do.
And don't ignore violence on campus.
All right. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook by searching for Campus Killings Podcast. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.